Roman Catholic Church celebrates a feast day known as Corpus Christi, the feast of the body and the blood of Christ. In some countries such as Ireland, which is heavily Catholic, this is an important celebration. In many rural communities, there is a Corpus Christi procession through the streets of the parish. Altar boys go ahead of the procession ringing bells to alert the faithful that the procession is coming. People come out of their houses, kneel, cross themselves as the Holy Eucharist passes by. A priest here in this country tells about some recent Irish immigrants who had just arrived in his parish and were unpacking their belongings in their new home. Suddenly, they heard bells ringing on the street outside. Well, the whole family immediately stopped what they were doing, went outside, knelt down, crossed themselves, just as the Good Humor ice cream truck went by. Well, it could have been a religious procession. For some people, eating ice cream is a sacrament. You know, there is power in tradition. Mark tells us that the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem were gathered around Jesus when they spotted something that offended them. Some of Jesus' disciples were eating without first going through the ritual of ceremonial hand washing. Now, this was not a matter of hygiene. The people of that time knew nothing about germs or viruses. But it's interesting that some of their dietary restrictions and practices undoubtedly protected them from some diseases. However, in this case, this was a matter of religious ceremony. So the Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" Now, that's a good question. Why didn't disciples keep this tradition? They, like Jesus, were devout Jews. They obviously kept other traditions of their faith. Why not this one? Their fondness for tradition has been one reason the Jewish community and the Jewish religion has survived today. Through much of their history, the Jews have been the persecuted minority. And their traditions have served as a key ingredient to maintain their identity. This is one way they could demonstrate their Jewishness. A father would instruct his son, and a mother would guide her daughter. As you know, there are special laws for diet. For example, a devout Jew will not eat a cheeseburger because you cannot eat dairy products with meat. If you ever go to Israel, you will not be able to buy a cheeseburger at a McDonald's. It's not even on the menu. Don't even try it. There are several special laws for relationships within a family as well as the outsiders, etc. There are laws, I think 635 laws. But these laws make for a vibrant and a cohesive community. Now, some of you have seen the musical Fiddler on the Roof. If you haven't, see it. Believe me. I have used Fiddler on the Roof for Bible studies to better understand the culture Jesus taught in because of its traditions. The story is set in 1905 in a small village in the Russian-occupied Ukraine. It centers on Treve, the father of 5 daughters, and his attempts to maintain his Jewish religious and cultural traditions. It is a constant struggle. For example, he is forced to cope with strong-willed actions of his 3 older daughters who wish to marry for love rather than having their marriages arranged by their parents, as was the tradition. Unfortunately, each choice of a husband moved the family further and further away from the customs of their faith. For Treve, tradition is everything. It governs how he eats, how he sleeps, how he wears his clothes. For instance, in his village, the men always kept their heads covered and always wore a little prayer shawl to show their constant devotion to God. Because of their traditions, everyone knew who they were and what God expected them to do. You know, there's a certain comfort in that. There's a certain comfort in living by such traditions. There's an order and a certain security. But for a group such as the Jews living as a minority in an often hostile world, such traditions were really the only way to survive as a community. And still, they were not always successful. Even Treve was threatened when his youngest daughter asked for his approval to marry. Horror of horrors, a Russian. On this, he cannot compromise, as you might imagine. Treve loudly declares, "Some things I will not and I cannot allow." Tradition. You know, most of us can appreciate his predicament. Others of us would feel smothered by such restrictions, but it is doubtful, considering all the persecution they have experienced, that the Jewish community would have survived without its traditions. Rabbi Alan C. Tufts tells a wonderful true story about World War II that is a perfect example of the value of tradition. It was about Private Winiger, who was with the U.S. Army as it marched through Europe at the end of the war. Winiger unit was assigned to a European village with the orders to secure the town, search for any hiding Nazis, and help the visitors in any way they could. Not the visitors, but the villagers in any way they could. Winiger was on patrol one night when he saw a figure running through the field just outside the village. He shouted, "Halt, or I'll shoot." The figure ducked behind a tree. Winiger waited, and eventually the figure came out. Thinking that Winiger was no longer nearby, he went to the spot near a large tree and started to dig. Winiger waited until the figure had finished digging and was once more on the move before he stepped out and again shouted, "Halt, or I'll shoot." The figure ran. Winiger decided not to shoot, but to try to catch the running figure. He shortly caught up with the fleeing figure and tackled it to the ground. To his surprise, he discovered he had captured a young boy. An ornate menorah had fallen from his boy's hands in the scuffle. It was a menorah. It was a 9-branch candelabrum lit during the 8-day Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Winiger picked up the menorah. The boy tried to grab it back, shouting, "Give it to me, it's mine." Winiger assured the boy that he was among friends, that he himself was Jewish. The boy, who had just survived several years of the Holocaust and had been in a concentration camp, was mistrustful of all men in uniform. He had been forced to watch the shooting of his father, and he had no idea what had become of his mother. In the weeks that followed, Winiger took the young boy, whose name was David, under his wing. As they became closer and closer, Winiger's heart went out to the boy. He offered David the opportunity to come back to New York with him. David accepted, and Winiger went through all the necessary paperwork to officially adopt David. Now, Winiger was very active in the New York Jewish community, and an acquaintance of his, the curator of the Jewish Museum in Manhattan, saw the menorah. He told David it was a very valuable European menorah and should be shared with the entire Jewish community. He offered David $50,000 for the menorah. But David refused the generous offer, saying that the menorah had been in his family for over 200 years and that no amount of money could ever make him sell it. When Hanukkah came, David and Winiger lit the menorah in the window of their home in New York City. David went upstairs to his room to study, and Winiger stayed downstairs in the room with the menorah. And there was a knock at the door, and Winiger went to answer it. He found a woman with a strong German accent who said that she was walking down the street when she saw the menorah in the window. She said that she had once had one just like it in her family and had never seen anything like it. Could she come and take a closer look? Winiger invited her in and said that the menorah belonged to his son, who could perhaps tell her a little more about it. Winiger went upstairs, called David down to talk to the woman, and that is how David got reunited with his mother. He was reunited with his mother because he faithfully kept the traditions of his people. Tradition has been the primary glue that has kept the Jewish community together all these centuries. And the Pharisees treasured the tradition of their people. And really, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? As I have said, tradition can be a wonderful unifying force in a community. Traditions help us hold on to our past. Nostalgia is a powerful emotion. Now, I won't ask how many of you are antiques, love antiques. But someone spotted a sign in an antique shop, and it said, "Come in and buy what your grandmother threw away." Antiques, like traditions, help us hold on to the past. And some of us can be hypocritical in our condemnation of tradition keepers. There's a story about a so-called assimilated Jewish woman, that is, one who no longer keeps the traditions of her faith. She's from the Midwest who is visiting Philadelphia. She boarded the bus, and a few stops later, a man with a wide-brimmed black hat, white shirt, long black coat, black pants, black shoes, and a long curly black beard gets on and sits down beside her. The woman looks at him in disgust. "Jews like you," she hisses at him, "give us all a bad name." He looks at her puzzled, and he says, "I beg your pardon, madam?" She says, "Look at you. All in black, a beard, never take off your hat. It's Jews like you that give the rest of us a problem." And he says calmly, "I beg your pardon, madam, but I'm not Jewish. I'm Irish." The woman looks back and smiles. "Oh, how nice." You've kept your customs. She could accept the Amish person who maintained the traditions, but it was her own people who did the same thing, and she looked down upon. You know, tradition is a mighty force in our lives. It's important in our worship, in our celebration, in ways we conduct business, and in ways we judge what is acceptable behavior in all that life is. Traditions. From the time to time, people in our culture have tried to liberate themselves from the chains and the shackles of tradition as they have introduced it. But thank the Lord, they've had limited success. Tradition helps us discover meaning in our lives. It helps us to give a form of substance of life. Today we are builders on foundations that have been carved out by generations of thoughtful and courageous men and women who have gone before us. You know, this past week, that's what we've heard about John McCain. It wasn't necessarily his policies or his voting records or anything. It was his tradition of integrity. It was his tradition of resistance to what is wrong. That's the traditions. That's the memories that keep the memories and traditions that we all need. But we also need to go forward. We also need to go forward. The Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" However, for some reason, this question asked at this particular moment touched a sore spot with Jesus. He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commandments of God and are holding on to human traditions." This was rather a stark condemnation by Jesus of the Pharisees' faith. Could it be that Jesus' eyes these traditions as taking on an almost idolatrous significance for the Pharisees? You know, a good thing can be taken to extremes. We've always done it that way before. Even worse, there is a sense in which we can replace God through the use of traditions. We can keep other people at a distance as well. As in Fiddler of the Roof, Treve placed tradition over and above love of his daughters. And when that happens, when we get comfortable with our rituals and procedures and schemes of doing things, we no longer open to God's moving and liberating spirit. And we are not open to God's call to serve others. God then remains on our lips, but not in our hearts. And it is our hearts that Christ is concerned about. It is the inner person that Christ came to redeem. For the Pharisees, religion was primarily external. It was a badge of accomplishment, not a gift of grace. It was a means of dividing society into layers, not uniting it into love. Religious traditions have often been used to put people down rather than to lift them up. All of this was what Jesus meant when he said to the Pharisees that they did not have God on their lips. They had God on their lips, but not in their hearts. That, of course, has been true of many persons besides the Pharisees, including many Christians. In fact, some of the most evil people who have ever lived have had Jesus on their lips. Historians tell us that once there was a politician who had God on his lips. Indeed, He made free use of religious language. He talked about the blessings of the Almighty and how Christian principles would become the pillars of his new government. He handed out pious stories to the press, especially in the church papers. He showed the people his tattered Bible and declared that he drew strength for his great work from the holy book. Scores of pious people welcomed him as a man sent from God. His name? Adolf Hitler. Historians tell us that Hitler was a master of outward religiosity with no inward reality. God was on his lips, but not in his heart. Jesus knew that because a person says all the right things, it doesn't mean that their hearts are where they should be. As I mentioned many times, and I've mentioned it many times, it's the intention of what we do that counts, what's inside that counts more than what we do. Why do you do it? In fact, it has happened so often in our faith as it isn't with people in the world, for whom the greatest barrier comes to authentic faith in Christ is that they associate him with many Christians whom they have met who are in no way like Jesus. Their actions are anything but humane or loving toward others. They have God on their lips, but not in their hearts. Reading once again from Matthew 7:21-23. It's from the inside, from the human heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual sins, thefts, murders, adultery, greed, evil actions, deceit, unrestrained immorality, envy, insults, arrogance, and foolishness. And all these things come from inside and contaminate a person in God's sight. Now, I know this sounds judgmental. I know it does. But that does not keep it from being true. Many people who call themselves Christians do not follow Jesus at all. Do we seek after his love, his compassion, his commitment to a better life for all people? Do we? Do we? Or are we satisfied with looking like Christians, keeping the traditions of our faith? Tradition can be a wonderful thing. It only becomes destructive when we use it as a means of looking like a follower of Jesus rather than actually following him. Now, the question we need to answer ourselves this morning is this: where is God in your life? Is he the center of your heart? Is he the one who determines your attitude towards others? Or is he simply an excuse for your attitude? When you read 1 John 4:8, whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. What does that mean to you? What does that verse mean to you? Can you honestly say that you know the God whose nature is love? Is God simply on your lips but not in your heart? We all have traditions that are sacred to us. That's good. That's good. Let's not use them to look down on others whose traditions are not our traditions, though. Instead, let us focus on God, who is the center of our traditions. Let's seek to imitate the God whom we have encountered in Jesus Christ, whose name and nature is love. Now, this morning we're going to be celebrating the sacrament of Eucharist. Now, God offers us, each and every one of us, deep inner cleaning. Violence in all forms destroys what is valuable to God. We are called to challenge this destruction. Be like Jesus in your heart. Witness the power of God's love. God blesses those who are doers of his word. Amen.